It's been a little over a year since you were on the podcast.
Oh, wow.
Last when I was traveling. That was September of last year.
Wow.
So 13, 14 months. And yeah, it's interesting. I ask you how it is to be here. For me, it's really interesting. I feel like things are coming up. It used to be this whole like process for me driving. I was living in Denver, driving up to Boulder. So we're in Boulder, up in the canyon, this beautiful home. And there's a studio that we used to have our in-person sessions. When I was going through it, doing some work, dark night of the soul, shifting identities, abandonment wounds, inner child wounds. And almost a year ago is when I reached out to you through this process. So yeah, it's interesting to come back now. Like I feel like a completely different person. I'm curious if there's anything just alive for you as we're back in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking back to when we first started working together, and you were in the transition already, right? You were in the kind of thick of things.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it probably started a year before, but it was like probably a month or two before we really connected on a coaching level. That I was like, okay, I gotta meet these demons rather than just keep trying to push through.
I'm so curious, like you being in it, what had you like work with me? Like, what was it about?
Yeah, so it's a very specific memory. I've told this a lot. Shared this with you. Were on a guest speaker in my men's group about a month ago, and so the impetus really was I was shifting identities. I quit coaching CrossFit in person, and that was actually way harder than I thought. And I had dreamed for so long of just life coaching full time, leadership coaching. And then it was like, who am I without this title, strength and conditioning coach? Like, it's been a part of my adult identity. And I was like transitioning with like a new group of friends and just like felt a call to leave Denver, which is then when I decided to travel for a month abroad. And during that process, the end of it was challenging. There were a lot of things going on. Navigating a relationship with your sister that had a lot of ups and downs. I wouldn't say, I don't know if I want to say that. My stuff was coming up, her stuff was coming up, past wounding, our own personal growth, which has been a big lesson of like in relationship. I think you have one of the biggest opportunities for growth, for transformation. And I got back from traveling and really just felt like I had no grounding in any category of my life. Like I got back, and Amelia's been on the podcast. A lot of the listeners, have heard our story where, that was uncertain. I was in a new house with a new roommate. I didn't know what direction I wanted to go with my business. I felt like training is so important to me, like CrossFit or running. And I didn't know what I was doing there. I didn't know where I wanted to be. And I was just kind of feeling lost. And I remember you posted something on Instagram that I messaged you about. And I think it was about like, I can't remember exactly. I'll be curious if you remember something along the lines of like, it's okay to not know, or this is like a season where you might be transitioning or like, surpassing this identity or whatever. And I sent you a question. I was like, how do you know? Or something like that. And then we just started a dialogue. And basically I shared something. I was like, yeah, I just don't feel like myself. Like, and I don't know what would feel more like myself, but like, I just, and you were like, oh yeah, this like shift in identity. Like, it really sounds like there's some grief there. And you were like, I can so have compassion for that. It's like when you surpass this old identity, it's like trying to fit into old skin and you can't quite fit, like putting on a shirt that's too small from a different time in your life. And you sent me an audio message, and I remember I was at my house in Lohi in Denver in the kitchen, and I just started bawling my eyes out. I just started crying. I was like, that's fucking it. That's the feeling. Like I finally had words for what was happening. And that's when I was just like, I don't know what's next, but I need to work with you if you're open to it. So that was a little longer, answer to your question.
No, it's great. It brings me back. I can remember that. The feeling of talking to you and like I think that life is filled with moments of transitions and changes, and I would say if we were like really tuned in with our sensitivity, we'd probably feel the deaths that happen every single day. Those moments where identity shifts in some way, but remembering back to when when we had that conversation, I would say that I could feel these kind of moments where, yeah, the skin doesn't fit, that we're trying different things out and nothing's really feeling like it's satiating in the same way or nourishing in the same way. And oftentimes we don't see that as a moment to like recollect ourselves and maybe move through a death ceremony, move through a grief ceremony, move through these kind of moments where we offer up what once was, that's no longer feeling right. Like feeling lost is a really big sign that something's not working, that something is ready to shift, not feeling like yourself, because the self is shifting. So, and we haven't yet met the new self because there's no space for the new self. So yeah, just thinking back to that moment, it's like, oh, I didn't remember how we met or how we started working together. I remember how we met, but I didn't remember how we started working together. And yeah.
Yeah, and
sweet.
So it's so interesting, this shift. Hold on one second. I don't know why my audio is so quiet.
Yeah, in comparison.
Yeah, I'm kind of nervous because at first it was check. Ooh, hello.
Hello.
Check. Okay. I guess we're just gonna wing it. See if this works. Thanks for hanging in for this little. Got a new setup. Trying to film these. But yeah, going back to what you said, this the shift of identity has been or this idea of shifting identities has been so powerful, and like what you said, this needing to like clear out the old in order for the new to come in. And what's really fascinating is I just month and a half ago went to this men's retreat, and the first 2 days it was just like fucking the work. We were deep in it, like, practices and, letting our emotions out and just like really leaving everything out on the desert that we wanted to leave behind, like old programming, old wounds, old traumas. And it was heavy. And it wasn't until that process that then comes Sunday and Monday, like, I felt the shift inside of me. And that's when it really resonated. There was actually one short story I'll tell is Saturday morning, we had this meditation, this breath work that I've done before. It's like holotropic breath work. Some people might call it conscious breath work, but like essentially it induces this physiological state in the body, which is like to help move trauma and energy, right? So like your hands might get tetany, you might shake, you might cry, like all of these things. And I got to that place in the breath work and I'm like, this feels amazing. And then immediately my head went to, okay, what do I need to do when I go back to Denver to like keep these things? Like the doing, the like, this survival, this wanting to grasp onto this sensation. And I shared that with the group after. Really the practice is just being. And, I'm like, why can't I just be? What's wrong with me? And then come Monday morning, we had a meditation and I was just empty. Like I had moved all of this, like this old identity, these old wounds, the old trauma. I had actually like created space to just feel the bliss. And it was a different breath work, but similar. And I could just be there and I could just be present. And I feel like that's a lot of the work that you and I started doing. And, I imagine if anyone is, as you're listening to this, like there's a lot of things that are going to start to resonate where you're like, oh, I didn't quite know how to like talk about that feeling or that sensation. And it's really our whole life, we're going to be shifting our identity. Like we're going to be surpassing who we were to who we are meant to become. And first of all, like that's what we need to do. Like that's part of life. But I think the thing that, at least for me, I really misunderstood was like, you have to like fully feel and move through those old parts. And like grief, you mentioned this word grief, and up until this point, I don't think I ever knew what grief was. I like,
Mm.
oh yeah, like my grandmother died when I was a kid and I cried, and that, that's grief or whatever, a loss. But really understanding it was a process of grieving this old part of me, this old version of me, and like equally letting that die, and also just having gratitude for the good and the bad and the challenging and the joyful parts of that to create space for like who I wanted to become. And I feel like that was the foundation of a lot of the work that we started to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like grief is such a powerful way for us to let life fully in. I think that there's, as I spoke to earlier, there's so much that happens and so much that fills the moments in our life, whether that's, beautiful moments and eye-opening moments and sweet moments with friends and loved ones, or whether that's like things not going the way that we had imagined and created in our mind, or relationships ending, or a job unexpectedly ending, or maybe something is not quite clicking in your business the way that you're wanting it to. And so there's kind of that coming to that realization that, oh my God, I've been trying to be someone I'm not this whole time. Like, this is not congruent with actually what the way is. And I think when we can actually start to like let ourselves drop into touching those experiences, those deaths, those little moments where something is ending, whether it's a big thing experience, like someone's dying, or a partnership is ending, or something that's happening in our world affairs, or it's those kind of little moments of, something, you coming to terms, you coming to let life fully touch you, and you touch it back by feeling it. I think that's the way we can do it. And I mean, grief, I think, is just the other side of love. Like, the more we grieve, the more we feel, the more we let ourselves kind of drop into these places that don't feel comfortable, the more we have for love, like room we have for love.
Yeah, heartbreak is the heart opening.
Mm-hmm.
It develops more capacity.
Yeah.
It's like something that we need. And yeah, it's interesting. We were talking a little bit before, and we're definitely going to talk about inner child work, because that was a big part of this. And really, in the work that I do, it's like there's an aspect of understanding your inner child wounds, trauma, energy, stress. Like, to me, all these words are interchangeable. And it doesn't have to be big things. Like, it can be these small aspects. But you can notice like that informs our adult life, right? Things that happen in childhood experiences, because we can't make sense of the world. And we carry that with us, and it's often at a subconscious level. And until we bring awareness, we can't choose something different. It's like, running on autopilot. And what's interesting, as I've been doing more men's work, we've been diving into this. We've been diving into the shadow, which also is often informed by our childhood, what creates our shadow, these different parts of us. And I found that even the guys in my group, like, they're committed, like, they're doing the work, and it's like there's still layers deeper we can go. And I think like awareness is a great start around, these wounds, these issues that we have. But like you said, like, the grief is like to fully feel it, to fully embody it. And I've seen this constantly in men that was in my own self. Well, these patterns keep repeating themselves. And I'm like, why do I keep feeling off? Because for me, it was like over a year-long process. And then it finally came to a head where the universe is like, hey, like, and Francis Weller actually talks about this, like this initiation was starting. And it's like the soul calls you into the initiation. Like, you don't really have a choice. But you can choose to accept it and go through it and come the other side, or you can just like keep having these patterns recreate. And that's what it was for me, like choosing to travel and put myself in storage was something I've always desired. And also it was like, okay, I'm unhappy here. Like, it's easier to go somewhere new. It's easier to like be alone and isolated in a new place rather than, where I already have friends, because that feels uncomfortable. And so like, I think that's the layer that we got into, is like, I started to actually grieve and feel and bring aware, like, all these parts of myself that I never connected, which was hard. challenging and uncomfortable. And I remember there were moments when I was like, I just want to feel okay. And you're like, okay, wait, what does that feel like? You know? But it was necessary. And it's just interesting reflecting right now. Like I feel like a completely different person. And
Totally.
It took a lot to get there.
Yeah. You see it, you're staying with yourself more. I think that's the biggest thing that I'm aware of. Like, I think when we started on, it was kind of like, I'm going to, I'm going to make 5K. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to create all these things. I'm going to, my job, and maybe I'll go travel. And it's kind of more out. And I think that's what we're really taught to do, is like what can we create? What can we do? And in that, I think what can get missed is, how am I staying with me? Am I staying with the present moment? That's such a common thing we know, but it's like, how much am I willing to stay and bring my awareness and bring my attention to what is happening? Because it's like that moment, where maybe emotion comes up, or maybe you're feeling lost. It's like, are you willing to fully bring the presence there and stay with it, and not pull out by making yourself feel bitter, or not pull out and make yourself be overly grateful, and not pull out and bring your focus anywhere else? Like what we did in our sessions really is like that willingness to stay so with it, even when it gets uncomfortable, even when you want to shift something, even that. And that's the very thing that actually creates space for the shift, that actually creates the transformation, that actually accesses that kind of true level of gratitude, versus the things that kind of take us, like bypass around the uncomfortable things. And I think that, you wanting to leave and travel is like a great example of what was happening internally. And now it's like, I witness you and I'm like, well, you're all here. You're very centered. And even when watching things around you, like even when we had dinner the other night, just watching you really stay with yourself and bring yourself back to you. And I think that's the loudest piece of awareness. The loudest thing I notice is different.
Yeah, I appreciate that reflection. I think that's a cool distinction for the audience, is like, yeah, I want to get into inner child work, in a second, and start to define some of this stuff, because I think it'll be really valuable. But I want to bring this up because it keeps coming alive with like my one-on-one clients, with guys in my men's group. But this, essentially what I started going through was what some, in the spiritual world or personal growth world, people might call the dark night of the soul. Or Carl Jung talks about the nigredo, which is also a term used in alchemy, which is defined as like the blackening, or translated as like the blackening, or this like death. And so essentially, I think we can have these like minute identity shifts like throughout our whole life. Like every moment we're constantly like, I'm not the same person I was yesterday. Like I believe that, and also there's going to be these pivotal times in our life, typically in our American society, around like middle school, high school, driving, turning 18, graduating college, getting married, like those. But it could be different for everyone. But I think that this nigredo, this dark night of the soul, it's really this pivotal moment. It could be in your 20s, it could be in your 40s. Like some might call that this midlife crisis, like quarter life crisis, whatever. But like it's this big pivotal moment where like you're ready, your soul is ready to surpass this identity, to let go of the old you. And that's what was happening. And it felt like everything in my life was falling apart. It felt like all of these challenges. And the difference from before and after was like, yeah, I used to just run away. I've actually moved around a lot and taken jobs that I didn't really want. And in hindsight, I can look and see this process might have been happening for 3 or 4 years, to be honest. And I'm realizing that in this moment. And for me, I'm really good at being alone. I'm not good at being lonely necessarily. And being alone is like the physical. So like I can go be in a new place, and like internally it's easier to like go start over somewhere new, rather than feel like, oh, I've lived in Denver for 5 years and I feel lonely. Like that's harder. But to your point, it's like staying with that part, just noticing me like, oh, am I wanting to leave because I'm running? Or is it because that is exciting, And what you're talking about at dinner the other night, I was with your family, and there's a lot of like high energy generators, if you're used to human design, and everyone's talking, getting their word in, trying to speak up, share what they want to share. And I was just kind of just observing and centered with myself. And that was me just noticing and witnessing and not feeling the need to be something that I'm not, or feeling wrong for like not operating the same way, you know? So those are like different flavors of what you're saying. But I bring up the dark night of soul, the Negredo, because so often when something is alive for me, where I go through something, then it's alive in the world for everyone else. And like I mentioned with you, this grief, this like trying to fit into old skin, like I didn't know what I didn't know. And so I want to share this because it's likely if you're listening to this, you're like having an aha moment already. Oh my God, this is it. This is what I've been feeling. I've been feeling like the things I used to desire, I don't desire anymore. Like I achieved all my goals and I'm still not feeling satisfied, or like these patterns keep happening in my life. I keep feeling stuck. And it's time to like bring that to your awareness and really start to do this work, start to let go. What are the parts you want to let go of? And then what do you want to move into? But a big part of that for me was realizing, this connects to like the shadow and our inner child, is there are these operating systems. The way I'll be curious your thoughts. The way I like to think about it sometimes is like a computer, and I'm not a tech person, but like you have the computer, the hardware, and then you have the software. Every once in a while, you need to update the software, you know, to a new version, or your phone needs an update. And that's essentially what was happening, is like I was operating from these wounds around, like when I was like 5 years old, 7 years old, 10 years old. And then, you know, it would manifest where I would like project on other people, or get really defensive, or get upset, or want to run away, or avoid things. And it wasn't really my like 32-year-old self. It was the 7-year-old who came online. And although it was created as a safety mechanism, because I couldn't make sense of the world when I was 7, it no longer serves me in this world. And that's like kind of the introduction I had to inner child work, of like, oh, this is why it's important, because otherwise I'm you know, it's like, you know, Carl Jung says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it'll direct your life, and you'll call it fate. So I said a lot.
I mean, it's, I was just going back to, you know, that moment where you are in the thick of it and you're feeling lost and nothing is tasting great. Like you're just kind of like, life is maybe not as shiny and bright as you've once tasted it. You're like, I know this is not it. I feel lost. I feel confused. I'm not excited when I get up in the morning. Even the job that I used to love is not feeling great anymore. The relationship I used to have, you know, this steeped moment is so potent. And it also takes a lot of honesty. It takes a lot of like coming to terms of like, okay, what if I don't try to just fix this right now? What if I actually let myself be in this feeling? Like, what is this trying to show me? Like, I know that you've experienced this, but oftentimes in sessions, I get really excited when grief comes, or when, you know, Taylor's like, I can't do this anymore. You know, these moments where we just kind of like, something gets really hard, or a shadow shows up, or a wound shows up, because they're showing up, because they're here, they're at our door, and and it's like, are we going to welcome them in? And I'm like a host that I'm like, oh, I've set up the house, you know, I have drinks out, I have food, you know, I'm ready to feed these aspects that are already existing. And so this moment, if you're finding yourself in this place where you're like feeling stuck, things aren't quite clicking, maybe your business has come to a certain level, or your relationships come to a certain level, and it's something's off, then can you allow this to be a really potent moment where you're like, okay, there's potence, there's something that is dying to change here. There's something that is craving something new. And instead of going to finding the thing that you think is new, can you go down into the feelings that you might not want to feel, the kind of like, what's not working? Why? Yeah, what's going on? What stories do I have about myself? And this is where it really links into, you know, our inner child, because you start getting curious, and you start maybe even getting curious to where you know, see if you can just set aside judgment, or set aside shaming yourself, or set aside getting anywhere. Like, let yourself have those eyes of the child, you know, that view of curiosity as you're inquiring. And I think oftentimes we access our curiosity by connecting to our inner child. And then if you have inner child wounds, you can really you can get binded in this kind of space where maybe you're in this lost feeling and you're trying to get curious, but you have judgment because that's what you received when you were a child, which is an inner child wound, and then you can't have curious, right? So it starts to make this cycle of stuckness because you've got your inner child wounds, and then you're also not feeling like you're in a good place. And so these kind of create it can create a really not the best container for you to move through unless we start to create a version of ourselves. We start to bring that conscious attention to both the stuckness and the inner child and start to be like, okay, let me look at this. Let me feel this. Let me start to see something different through letting myself be present with the things I don't want to feel, and that's where staying with yourself is so key.
Yeah, you have to feel it in order for it to move. Right?
Feel it to heal it.
Feel it to heal it. I like that. I've said this so many times on this podcast, but emotions are just energy in motion, and they're meant to move. And this, I'm laughing so hard because I remember all these moments where you're like giddy and excited. You're like, oh yeah, like we're here.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what? I don't want to feel this. I have to go deeper. Like, what are you talking about? And it just it felt like it was, getting pounded by wave after wave after wave. The barrel is just closing out on you. And ironically, now I do the same thing with clients where I can see the different aspects. And the common thread is so many clients, we start to get somewhere and then they go immediately to solving the problem. And that's very much also like part of the masculine. But even I have a newer client who's a female client, and like we started going into some old stories. And immediately she's like subconsciously, like she doesn't realize this, like wanting to bypass like what do you see? Like, I want to know your thoughts. Like, where should we go from here? And I'm like, whoa. Like, we're just going to keep pulling back the layers. Like, not much is going to happen, to be honest, right now. And even in some of the guys in my men's group, like we start to get back to like old wounds, and I can tell them get uncomfortable and start to close off and start to wall off because they don't want to feel it. Which it can be really uncomfortable and challenging, but that's the only, like, if to go fully in the depth, like you said earlier, like really pull back all those layers is the only way to like completely move through it. And then something I imagine we'll talk about is ultimately we're not, and this is true of the shadow too, we're not looking to just like get rid of that part of ourselves. We're not looking to like kill it off, to leave it behind, to lock it away in the basement. It's cultivating a relationship with it, So all of that being said, like, how would you define, we've been talking about it, but inner child wound, like what exactly is that? Why does it come about? Is it something we all have?
I don't know if it's something everyone has, but I imagine a lot of people do, just with especially some of the Western global structures we have with parenting or I imagine that everyone.
I think we all do. That's my belief. Is like I think everyone does.
Yeah.
Because even the most like conscious, growth-minded, parent, like there's gonna be things subconsciously that like.
Yeah, there's no way you can be perfect,
right? And
yeah.
Because I'm more than happy to dive into my story, but like that's why I think it took me so long in my life to like realize I had childhood wounds, because on paper, like my childhood is ideal, so yeah, that's just my 2 cents. I think we all have wounding. It's just likely, or it could likely be not what you think. Like it does. Like, from what I've learned from you and our process is like, it doesn't have to be this like big physical sexual abuse, huge traumatic life event. It could be like, being picked on for having a big nose or something,
Or those, I mean, I totally agree with you with the everyone has these forms of wounds, because just thinking that, even those that have amazing life, we are all in this system. We're in this collective of humans, that it's just kind of like there's still, one's not free unless we're all free, this kind of level of healing. And even if you have a perfect family, it's going to be that one moment where it's like, it was too perfect and I never got to feel this. And so there's always something.
Yeah, that's my story is, I think essentially I love my parents to death. I don't know if they're going to listen to this. But I think they had some challenges as children.
Yeah.
Financially, the structures, they had, a lot of disadvantages, and they became very successful, and they wanted me to have the childhood that I didn't have, that they didn't have. And some of those aspects led to they had the best intentions, wanting to fix things, solve things, like help me figure things out, like make me feel better, which led to, as a kid, not really knowing that I just wanted to be told that it was okay to feel what I was feeling.
Yeah.
And part of this too, I think, is as a child, you create stories to make sense around you. Like you can't, if your father or mother has a temper and they get upset or angry, like you can't make sense that like that's a them problem and not a you problem. So you internalize it and you create stories. And so, yeah, for me, like I was very privileged growing up. I had a lot of opportunities. And the thing that I craved more was like the emotional side. And not to say that we didn't, they didn't share emotions, but again, that was just like my child brain interpreting.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're not flawed. That's the interesting thing, is like nobody is without flaw. So even those parents that are super conscious, there's still something that it has been passed down. Like, I imagine for all the parents listening or any teachers listening, you kind of sit in front of your child and they're probably going to bring up all of the wounds that you've never healed and you didn't want to look at and you thought you were over. And then they say this one thing that triggers this thing, or they embody the very thing that you don't know how to love in yourself. And I think that's where, these children are walking medicine. They're beautiful teachers for all of us to witness, how oftentimes untamed they are so early on. So which kind of points to where we started this seed that we came in with. And I think also wounds are part of our story. I think I'm starting to sit more and more as I think about these moments where we felt disconnect, or the hard moments, or you feeling lost. Those moments are actually that kind of fruitful space where we, get to touch grief, and we get to touch these harder moments, which, expands us into more of who we are, to feel that contrast, to feel that the difference allows us to have more capacity, more range, and more understanding of our human experience. So it's just interesting, going back to that inner child wound. What a blessing to be able to have these pains, and I don't wish it upon everyone, the suffering and things like that many go through, and for us to be able to like touch that and feel that so we can move through that. Just thinking to going back to what your question was around what's an inner child wound. There's a lot out there. Like if you just go look up on Google what is an inner child wound, I imagine you'll find a lot. Abandonment, self-sabotage. There's a lot that can, it's ways that we disconnect, really. Like I think what it comes down to, it's any way we disconnect. And I imagine oftentimes it's sourced in something happened when we were younger. Because even if it stems way before that, we're going to recreate something in this lifetime and then the next lifetime. Or our father, we'll create something that happened for our father in our life because it just wants to be healed. And I think wounds gets passed down our ancestral line. Wounds keep coming up in our own life from childhood because they just want completion. They want that moment where they had the full presence turned towards them, where they had someone to be like, I'm just here, feel what you need to feel. Like I'm with you. You know, we these wounds want something different or they wouldn't keep repeating themselves. And we have collective wounds that keep coming up collectively that are like, you know, could be looked at as like one inner child of one we had a long, long time ago, had an experience or something rift. And now we are playing it out collectively because it just wants to be completed. And so we get to do our individual work with the inner child work. We get to be that loving parent, father or mother that we never had, or we get to be that teacher that we had never had. So we are essentially all the archetypes within us of our life, and we're creating the ideal versions to meet our young parts, to meet our teen parts, to meet our successful parts. You know, it's that kind of, that's what we're bringing into harmony. When we say world peace, we're like inner peace. We're saying, how can I bring things into right relationship? You know, to where if I have something come up, it's not hijacked because my inner child wound doesn't think I'll listen to it, so it hijacks my system, and then it thinks that my partner's cheating on me, and you know, it goes down this whole rabbit hole. Versus the wound comes up, and I have the ideal mother or father online, and I'm like, hi. You know, we did this a lot during those.
I was actually going to dive into like a little example.
Yeah.
So I'm a big like systems person. I just like see things in systems. So I'm going to share the way I see it, and you can add on or be like, oh, I don't feel like that's true. So my belief is we all have these childhood wounds, right? And again, a wound could be, I don't know, I feel like trauma is such a popularized word. It could be this big trauma. It could be like, your parents worked too much and you wanted more love, or your parents didn't, you know, the opposite could happen where like all they did was focus on you and you're like, oh, I wish they would have like focused on themselves more. You know, it's like no matter what, there's going to be something that comes up. So we have this wound and then we create this like operating process or conditioning, or it's almost like putting on glasses. It's this lens now how we see the world and how we show up, right? So if we have this wound that a parent is, you know, really has a big temper. So then maybe the wound is like, we don't want to get in trouble. Like I need to be a good little boy. And we become a people pleaser, and we create this programming, this conditioning, this way of operating where it's like, okay, if I'm a good little boy, then my parent won't get upset at me. Right. And it makes sense and it works. It's like a safety mechanism at that time in our life. The problem is as we grow up, it's no longer supportive. We no longer need that. And to realize that that wound was not actually about us. It was like our parent who had their own reasoning or issues going on that they needed to heal. And then we become 10, 20, 30 years old and, you know, we're a people pleaser. Or like for this masculine archetype, the nice guy, where, you know, it's the phrase happy wife, happy life. And we just do other things for other people and focus on other people. And then we become resentful. And then we get in this pattern. And so I think this process of, okay, how do we move through this? Or I partly share that. Why is this important? Well, it's important because if you don't want to keep having these patterns in your life, you need to bring awareness, then you need to heal the wound and be in relationship with the wound. And so the step-by-step process is one, understanding, okay, we all have these wounds. It's not good or bad. It's just part of us. Creating awareness on like, oh, what is the wound? Where did it come from? And then connecting to it, building a relationship with it. Because as you said, like what happens is we get hijacked. And so for me, we worked through many, many different things, but one iteration was this program of like, I'm not loved or I'm not worthy of love. Like that was a wound, which partly childhood, I would also say some like adult experiences that like informed that. And essentially it informed this belief on my life, the glasses that I was wearing. But the fascinating thing is it's at the subconscious level and I'm not aware of it. And so then I get into relationship and there's this anxious attachment that manifests, and I don't want to be anxious. I don't have anxiety, around my relationship, or like, are they pulling away or what's happening? And one thing you helped me see is, okay, one, we were created awareness around this wound of like wanting love, desiring love. And then two, being able to notice, like the progression was, okay, when this wound comes online and the anxiety is like, oh, I can just meet that. I can just say, oh, okay, I see you. Because what I found in my own life and with other people is they try to fix it outwardly. And what you talk about, like the reparenting, is like, really, I need to love myself, which might sound a little silly or like, oh yeah, Taylor, okay, like love yourself, whatever. But like truly, I needed to have enough love for myself that I didn't like, yeah, I can desire love from other people's, but I don't need it, you know?
Yeah.
And that's where it's like building that relationship. So with that kind of framework that I just created, what are kind of some tools or some tips for like, you know, if we go through that process of like identifying the wound, connecting, relating to the wound, and then healing it?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I just really want to come back to something really quickly before I go there, which is, you know, love yourself. Genuine love. And to get to genuine love, to actually be like, oh my God, you know, God, this shadow. Wow. Like to really find love for that part, even if you don't accept the way that or you don't, you know, approve of the way it shows up all the time, but you accept it. To love, that genuine love often takes a lot of curiosity. It takes getting why it does that and being like, you know, it's like a kid punches someone when they're young and you're, instead of being like, don't do that, you should never, you know, and you create the wound, right? Because you get angry and then they're like, oh my God, and they feel shame, and then that's where this kind of like something is created in that moment. Instead it's like, hey, how'd you punch? You know, what was going on? Well, I was feeling a lot and I had so much energy and I didn't know what to do and I wanted to fight back and I felt really angry and he just wasn't listening, right? And there's all this energy, pent up energy that's in there. I think the energy that we actually can use to release and feel that are still stored in our body, that energy not having that happen when we're younger gets clumped and gets balled and gets shoved in our system. And so, you know, we get stuck energy, stuck creation, stuck chi. But I just really wanted to come back around to that love piece, because I think that there's a lot of people that could be listening that, you know, that would be like, yeah, self-love. Yeah, I love you. You know, I love you. And it's not quite. It's like you can kind of feel when someone's not being honest about love, and so can our parts.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you talk about that. This idea of integration, I've been really leaning into recently. Amelia and I actually went to this art integration workshop, and it was like the week or 2 weeks after my retreat, with, you might know her friend Danielle. She's a therapist and does art therapist, but she led it, and we just had a discussion on integration, and this could be anything in life. How do you integrate from or process like an experience you had, a download, a like therapy session, a breakup, getting a new job, like there's all of this, right? And I think the biggest difference is shifting from the knowing, the intellectual, to like it being true, feeling in your body or in your system. And so like you said, like, you know, we probably worked together for around 6 months, and this stuff came up early on, but it took a lot of time to integrate that to where it was like, okay, like I can see intellectually that like I should love myself, but like it doesn't feel true. Like it doesn't, because of the way that I was showing up, you know. And so one thing I just want to name there, like the integration process is like that trueness, that knowing in your body. And it's like what you said, like how you feel me differently now versus then is like it has resonated.
You were like up here.
Yeah.
Here up
in my head.
before.
Yeah. Now it's like down into my heart. And the other thing I want to say is like, this is going to be a process. If you want to do this inner child work, like it might seem daunting, it might seem scary, but like you'll likely be doing it your whole life.
Yeah.
And I would say like heavily, I've been doing it for about a year. And the nice thing is like, I don't know if easier is the right word, but it's like not as emotionally charged as I tap into these things.
Yeah.
But like we did deep work for 6 months. I had more space and moved through it. And then more recently I went to this retreat and it was like deeper levels of this inner child work, but I could only get there because of the foundational work that we did. So just know that like it is a process, and with any process, there's not necessarily like a timeline.
Yeah.
And like when you can let go of that, I think that's when you can, you know, really like get the fruits of the work.
Yeah. Is it when we started working together, was that the first time you had heard of inner child?
I had heard of it. To be honest, I didn't believe I had any inner child wounds. I was like, I'm
fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, I hear people who had like, I don't know, both their parents were killed in a car accident, or like they had sexual abuse, or maybe they were a teen drug addict, or, you know, these like not ridiculous, but like very, very massive things.
Yeah.
That are a lot to hold. And so I was like, okay, well, like none of those things happen to me.
Yeah, which this is a great example of the bypass,
Yeah.
right? Well, there's so much worse, right? And so it's a good way to take yourself out of self-responsibility, of
Mm.
that, take yourself out of the wounds, take yourself out of that kind of like, or the gratitude thing. I think gratitude is a powerful thing we should do every day. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying watch when it comes online, because there can be one that comes in online and it's like, I should just be grateful for what I have, or I should be grateful for my child because this and that. And it's like that, yes. And let yourself fully go into what happened, because it's true to some aspect of you. It's still playing out in your life. It's still causing havoc in
Yeah.
some way.
I love that you brought that up because I'll talk about myself, but like I have a newer client recently who like was talking about some experiences and was like, oh, but I want to also, I'm only focusing on the bad right now and I want to focus on the good. And I'm like, honestly, for our time together, I don't care about the good. Like, I understand that you're not just like a negative person. I've known you for some period of time, but like this is where the meat is. Like we want to dive into this. And this even came up when you were a guest on the men's group. People are like upset and you see these emotions like super emotionally charged. And they're like, but you know, this, and I'm grateful for this. And they really showed up for me here and they love me. It's like, whoa, 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 whoa.
Yeah.
Like that can be true, but like, let's just hold off. And like, you know, for me, it could be like, as I was going through this, like my dad worked a lot. I would say we weren't super close emotionally growing up. And it could be easy for me now. I have a beautiful relationship with him. And to be honest, as a kid, I didn't understand the sacrifices he made financially for our family and the opportunities like college, like every opportunity I ever had, really. So I have so much gratitude, but it would be easy for me like, oh yeah, like we weren't very connected, but you know, he was like providing for the family and blah, 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 and whatever. And it's like, I've seen this time and time again with clients in the men's group where like it could be so easy. And it's like the theme that seems to be coming up in this conversation is like, you got to let yourself get there. And then when you think you're there, there's probably somewhere to go deeper.
Yeah. I mean, I just had this thought. It's kind of like, do you want to go to paradise and like smell the beach and, you know, be in the seawater and have the actual sun? Or do you want to go into a Walmart that has, you know, a paradise set up and it looks the same? Like it's pretty similar. You know, they do a really good VR job, or even go on the VR goggles, you know, instead of Walmart, and you go on there and you can kind of experience it. Do you want the real thing? And I think that's the thing, is like gratitude when, or your life, when you've actually gone through the muck and the trenches of releasing and feeling all of that stuff, is like pure paradise. Because it's not this kind of like, it feels good and I can talk about my childhood and it was really good and my dad did so much and my mom did so much, right? Versus like, oh, I have to go through and feel the wounds, because then when I touch that, I'm like in tears and I'm blown away, and gratitude I didn't know could taste like this and feel like this. I didn't know my life could be like this. And so I'm just thinking back to one of the guys on your men's group that was like, I'm scared I'll lose this drive and this fuel and this passion if I start going into my wounds. And I'm like, if anything, it just amplifies your life. It's like you're like kinking these energy blocks that's been in your field that have been held for your inner child for so long, and you're unkinking those, and all of a sudden you have this access to life that is just rich and beautiful. And so it's not an easy journey, as you know. You're like, why aren't we done yet? This is like we've been going.
Yeah. Well, and oh man, there's so many threads here. One, to your point, is I've seen clients and guys in my men's group who they didn't realize it, but part of what is preventing them from going deep is they're afraid that like their wound is also something that made them really great. You know. And so I'll keep using myself as an example. One of the wounding being like, you know, wanting to receive love from other people. There definitely was this like nice guy tendency of like people pleasing, self-abandonment to like give everybody like what I would want, and doing it from this was subconscious at the time, a place of like, oh, well, if I do this, they'll do that for me. And that's also like what makes me who I am. Like I'm so caring and I like think through things and, you know, can really show up for people. And so the difference now is like, I don't have to lose that part of me. I can just now be centered and grounded on, okay, where is this desire coming from? If I want to like, go out of my way to help someone or support someone, is it from a place of like, yeah, that feels good to just give, love without any attachment, love without any agenda? Or is it like, oh, I'm doing this because I feel like I should, or I'm supposed to? And that's the difference. And so I think that's something to connect with as well. But yeah, part of the work, this memory popped up, is there was one period where like I was good. Like we got through the anxiety. I'm like on top of the world. I'm feeling great. And I'm like, yeah, this is like cool. We did it. I'm done with that. See ya, anxious attachment. And then about a month goes by and it kicked back up, and it was like all my stuff. And at first it was like specifically something in relationship. And I like started to project on my partner, and then I was like, oh, that's me. Shit. And I remember we had a session. I'm like, I thought I was good. Like, what? I thought we were done with this. I thought we like, locked it in the closet. And you're just smiling and you're like, no, no, no. Like now I think the specific way that you described it, you're like, no, it's like this is the cultivation of relationship. Like it's not getting rid of it. It's kicking it away. It's like when you see it come online, you can be like, oh, hey there. I see you. You can keep it in your back pocket. You actually want to keep it close to you, so that you can then have choice of how you operate.
100%. Yeah.
And so I think that's really important with this work too, is like, I mean, even all the work that I've done and where I'm at and how I show up, like it still comes up.
You're like growing your capacity. You're coming into right relationship, and you're growing your capacity to hold more and more of you, more and more of life, versus kick any part of you out. I don't know if that's the game.
Yeah. Well, and I can move through it quicker because I can now own these parts of myself. Rather than like being caught up in this repetitive cycle.
Yeah, and there's like, I imagine the beginning sometimes there can be shame or even numbness. Like, I'm thinking back to the question you asked of like, how can we access the inner child? I can't remember the second two, but just going to it quickly, how you can access is, if you start to just imagine yourself as a child, maybe think of a moment a memory that felt really sweet when you were growing up, or the first memory that comes to mind when you even start to talk about inner child in your system, or say hello, like that moment where you're just saying, all right, I'm ready to meet my inner child. You might not feel anything. You might feel numbness, and you might feel disconnected. And so it's just keep building that, keep accessing that memories. I'm just thinking back to when we first started working together. We did that meditation, and you're like, I'm not, or we saw something for a second, and then it like went away really quickly.
Yeah. Well, at first it was a memory that I'm like, yeah, this doesn't have anything to do with what I'm going through. Like that's literally what I thought. There was this memory of, I don't know if I want to go into the whole details of it, but essentially when I was like 5 to 7, I was climbing on the kitchen counter and I fell and busted my chin, and then I had to go to the hospital and get stitches. But then from that, I had like kind of disassociated from that, and like part of it was I was actually put in a straitjacket as a kid because I was so scared and terrified from getting stitches in my chin, and then I got out of the straitjacket. Talk about a traumatic event.
Yeah.
But the story that I've told my whole life from that was like, oh yeah, I got out of a straitjacket. Like, look at me. Like, I'm so cool. And my parents kind of, as they tell that story, they're like, oh yeah, remember when you did that? And I do really believe it is from a place of love. And then also like everything we talked about before, from a child, like how traumatic, how
terrifying.
Unsafe did I probably feel?
Yeah.
And unheard. And like, I couldn't make sense of the world around me, And so just noticing as we dove deeper into it, we could see, and I could start to connect dots of like, oh, this probably informed certain things for me that I just wasn't aware of and didn't remember and maybe dissociated from.
Yeah.
And like some of the men in my group, that's what happens. Like they can't remember. They are kind of numb to it. And so I really have learned from you, it's a practice.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what you think about this, because I don't know if we've actually talked about it, but one thing I've started doing is like anytime something's coming up in my life, whether it's a pattern or something I'm not proud of, or like when I am reactive or projecting onto other people, start to like be like, okay, where does that come from? Is there anywhere? And then I just start working my way back.
Yeah.
College, high school, middle school, like with family. I'm like, can I connect anything, even if it feels like a stretch of the imagination? And it doesn't always, cause and effect, right? I'm not going to say that like every time you do that, you're going to find a specific moment. But for me, that's helped me like have more memories resurface, have more, connections and relations just to, my younger self.
Yeah, I mean, you're building that pathway that if things come up that feel off or like it could be in the area of wound or disconnecting, that you're going to be present with it. Like you've trained your system now that if something comes up, you're like going to get curious. And so your system's going to start showing you more and more, and it's going to start healing more and more. And that's what, happened when we started working together, is that your system after that moment where it was like kind of is numb, and I'm like, great, we don't need to push it. We have to actually build and earn the trust of our inner child, especially if we haven't connected to it and haven't thought about it and haven't honored it and haven't honored these younger parts of ourselves for so long. We'll probably have to rebuild some trust, right? And so you going numb, or you not thinking of a memory, or you having that blocked is a good way of like, I don't trust you. The inner child being like, I don't trust you to hold me. I didn't trust life to hold me. Life didn't hold me, right? And so that's what that's showing you in that moment. And then over time, the more we started breaking through, your system just started opening to where you were like, okay, let me get, that spaciousness where you're like, I don't think we could do more. And you're like, kept going. And then we moved through and we had that opening. And I think that's that our system will start to show us. It will bring us the memories that don't feel like they are have anything related to what we're moving through, but yet our system is so much wiser than our mind at times. Our mind has like the kind of the tools, and it can help us with maps and structures. But really it's when we start to tune in and we ask for memories and start to build that relationship with our inner child. And really, inner child or stuck energies or wounds, all of these are in the same territory. And I would just go to say that, one of the ways that we can really start to connect is just make space for listening and presence. Maybe something came up in relationship and you got in a fight, and it's that moment you're feeling really angry. Just notice if you can just be with the anger and say, I'm here for it. I'm listening. Even you saying that, and it might feel weird and it might feel strange, but just letting some aspect of that someone's there, I think is such an underrated but profound thing that we forget to do.
Yeah, I started off the beginning, I think it was the beginning of this podcast, or maybe when we were talking before, that all of the work, that the culmination of like my entire coaching career is like there's some aspect of the inner child.
Yeah.
Something I've been doing for a long time is what I call story work. And I define mindset as the story that you tell yourself, right? Which is informed from our previous life experiences. And I've been doing this a lot with clients, where something might come up, a block or like a behavior or a fear. And then we go back to the youngest memory, which is actually, I really connected it, but is a form of inner child work where it's like, when is your previous memory? And then they'll write about it, and then we'll go through it. And then essentially we clean it up to be as objective as possible of like, what is true? Where it's like, oh, I went to this party and all the other girls, didn't talk to me and they didn't like me, and I'm not good enough. Like that was the story that was created. And so then I help clean up and rewrite the story to be like, okay, they didn't talk to you, like, period.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you weren't good enough, right? And we start to like rework it because the story gets, it's so interesting. Like we'll read it multiple iterations and then we'll modify it, and I'll have them breathe through it and slow down and feel into their body. And usually at first it's trapped in their chest, they're breathing, right? And that's where all the stored energy, like it's, and then they start to breathe deeper, and then they start to feel more relaxed, and they start to open. And so it's like, I've now been able to connect that more with like inner child and building a relationship, because it's not just one story. Like there's multiple stories, and to the point of feeling is so powerful too, where like, I had a client recently who anytime she gets feedback, it's like this big pit in her stomach. and like she doesn't handle it well. And we went back to a previous memory of being a kid. I think she was a kid and she like stayed over at a friend's house and got like pen ink on her friend's shirt, and the other mother just scolded her. And then that informed her whole life of like feedback, like she's bad or wrong, this story that was created. And so then there's like a little bit of like trying to be perfect and like not wanting to get feedback. And what's most fascinating is like she could put herself back in that 5-7-year-old self, and it's the same exact sensation in her gut as now an adult, and her boss at her corporate company gives her feedback. And so I think that's why what we talked about earlier, like your ability to feel, is you can actually notice like what's actually happening. Because often what's happening in our system can be very different from what we think is happening.
It's so interesting that, okay, there's two things, because I keep wanting to share something and then it goes away, which I trust. But the first thing is, I was talking to Amelia, and I don't remember who else is there, but we were talking about how, when you were younger, I don't know if your parents ever said this to you, but like school felt so long, everything felt so long. And my dad would say, when you're older, time moves faster. And I am now just in this moment thinking about how when you're a child, if we were to look at it from our adult and look back, we're like, it was a pen. It was a moment. It was just a pen moment. Like this one moment of the mother scolding this girl and with the pen. But when you're 7, life and time and everything is so much bigger. We have perspective now as adults. We have understanding and awareness. And so we look back at that and see it as such a minuscule thing, versus when you're 7 or when you're a child, life is giant. Everything that, like, one moment where your dad's shouting at you is like what might be for us like a huge war happening in our front yard, right? Like that, it's just that kind of, maybe it's not that extreme, but it's that level of openness to life and the bigness that happens. And so just wanting to put that frame in mind, because I think it's helpful for those that kind of might dismiss these small things. It's huge. It's big. Time felt really big growing up. I remember going to school and being like, this feels like forever. And then the second thing that you said that relates back to what you were just speaking about, of like, this tracing those threads back and kind of seeing what these moments that have created these stories and these lives for us. I think sometimes what we need to do is our adult self, we have to show who and talk and tell our child, our inner child, and even other parts of us, maybe angry part that never feels seen and heard, maybe the part in us that wants to run, right? Like I talk a lot in parts and aspects of ourselves, but we might need to tell them who we are and the tools we have now, and the relationships we have, and the ways that we've succeeded, and the ways that we have been met. It's not like meant to like if one part of you doesn't feel like it's been met, it's not to be like, yes, we have, don't do that. But it's more like our inner child that has all of these wounds and have all of these stories and protectors. It might need us to come sit down and be like, this is who I am now. Like, wow, when I get feedback, they're actually really kind. And I take a lot of breaths now and just updating them, and they're like, oh, so we don't freak out, because sometimes their files aren't updated. They're still living when they're 7 and they haven't been updated, that, now that, they're in relationship and they're in a really secure relationship, and then they have this moment where they're like, oh my God, they're going to leave. And then this part that feels that just hasn't allowed themselves to actually feel like, oh no, I'm in a safe relationship. Oh no, we have conversations when something goes hard. Wow, like actually my partner really receives me. So because we know that happens, but our inner child might not. And so it still feels a need to kind of hijack. And so sometimes having story time with all of your parts is really great, and being like, hey, like now when we get angry, here's how we move it. It's good.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. I speak that way a lot too, like these parts of ourselves. And often we identify that that's who we are. You know, one of my mentors has this quote that I love, that it's not who you are, it's what you learned. And if you learned it, you can unlearn it. And that's part of this process, you know? And so understanding that the anxious side of you or the angry side of you or, you know, the manipulative side of you, whatever it is, like that's just a part of you. But to your point, that part can just take over your whole system if you're not aware, if you're not conscious of it, you know? And like you said, where time goes slow when we're younger, like, you know, something like a pen or getting scolded feels like this big trauma, you know, and that's partly what we talked about. We're like, you don't need to compare your childhood wound to other people's, because the way that it landed for you, like, can be just as heavy as someone else.
Yeah.
And so that's what's fascinating around like the shadow and these patterns and things that happen is when we don't understand these wounds, when we don't start to move through the emotions, they just come online and they hijack our nervous system. And it's like autopilot. And so when we get defensive in relationship or project on other people, it's our nervous system comes online like the 7-year-old, not the 30, 40-year-old adult who can like, you know, make good decisions and take a breath or whatever. It's like and it's actually, it's called, as an adult, it's called protesting behavior. But you can imagine, which is an adult temper tantrum. Like little kids have these temper tantrums and they like throw fits and move their bodies and punch because they're moving energy and they don't really know how. They can't make sense of it. And as adults, we do the same thing. But what it might look like is, oh, you're becoming an avoidant, like you're creating space for me and I'm anxious. Well, I'm no longer going to show you love. I'm no longer going to, you know, do the things that I normally do for you. And that's protesting behavior. But that comes online. That happened to me because my 7-year-old is online, not my 32-year-old, you know? So yeah, it's really, really powerful, you know, the parts. And like you said, in relationship, like this has been something, it's been challenging and hard and confronting with Amelia and I, but we can actually have that conversation. We can actually say, oh, I noticed this wound is, you know, being activated, you know, and she can bring stuff to me and be like, oh, I'm realizing that my behavior, it's not actually about you. It's still something that I'm working through with, you know, my relationship with men in general, you know, and there's more understanding and, yeah, it's a process. 'Cause that's the thing is like, there are no perfect people.
Yeah.
And so when we can start to understand ourselves and our partners or like people we're doing life with, we can have more compassion and empathy for ourselves and other people.
Yeah. And you just had me think about, because I feel like with you and Amelia, you guys are so honest. You bring the truth, you bring the things that are hard, and then you transform and something shifts. Like your relationship that I witnessed to like, it can get really hard and then it gets, and you guys reveal a lot and then it like emerges into some more space and more opening and more love. And I think that's really beautiful to witness. And just even thinking back to identity shifts, you know, those of you that are in that potent moment, or you're in the thick of that transitional time, like the more that you stay, the more that you be honest, the more that you go in, that you'll naturally emerge. Like that's the becoming, that's the identity shift. And you naturally start to create differently, and you naturally, because you healed your fear around like being seen, now all of a sudden you're showing up more, and there's this whole different person you are because you gave yourself presence. You were willing to figure out who you are by listening to who you are, by feeling who you are, like or who you were, so that it can show you who you're becoming, you know, so that can transmute and open up more space. You know, so it's just like, yeah, getting to be a witness to your relationships, really a testament to that journey.
Yeah. Because early on, my nervous system, like, we'd have a hard conversation or like Amelia, you know, might need space or something. I'm like, okay, well, this is over. Like, this is done.
Yeah.
You know, like that's what happened. That's the way I interpreted it. And then through like a lot of difficult conversations and like, I mean, part of it is like just staying in. I would say like my biggest advice is like whatever you start to understand in relationship with your wound or your younger self is like, how close can you hold that thing? right? So if it's anxiety, it's like, okay, instead of like doing the thing that will release the anxiety, whether that's like, going to alcohol or like scrolling or, overly exercising. That's me right there.
Mm-hmm.
How can you just be with it? Or like needing to have a conversation or break up in a relationship. If it's the opposite, if it's like avoidance, you notice that comes up. It's like, okay, how can you like stay in conversation with someone?
Yeah.
How can you stay, close to the people or the thing that you're wanting to walk away from? And you can extrapolate that to anything. But I think that's part of the process. Man,
I know,
this
it's
is
so
so
good.
good, so
Yeah.
fun. I feel like this is a good point to kind of stop. I think one thing I want to say is hopefully we gave you a starting point. We gave you a little background. Hopefully you feel seen if you've been in that place, that Negrado, that dark night of the soul, that like stuck, uninspired, and just know that like, it's a thing and people are going through that. And maybe if you start to realize these patterns or these things from childhood, and Olivia gave us a bunch of great launching points. But what I found is if you really want to go deep into this work, you need support. Partly because it helps having someone objective. It helps having someone that you can talk through and experience and move through, because it is going to be a lot of energy. And so to try and hold that yourself is challenging. And it's really just going to help you, go faster, deeper where you want to go and move through it. So, these are the types of things we're doing in my men's group. And if you want to be around other men who are like here for the work, reach out to me. I'll link in the show notes. January will be the next round of the men's group. I'm also very much leaning towards trying to create something in person. So if you're in the Colorado area, but also Olivia is a great resource. She's, like I mentioned, my teacher, coach, therapist. Sometimes she just, smacks me around a little bit when I need it. And so, yeah, if anything that she resonated with, like, highly recommend working with her, reaching out. It's so powerful, the work that she does, and having her as an ally through this. So I can link your information in the show notes as well.
Great. Yeah.
But yeah, do you have any last thoughts?
No, it's just been just such an honor. I mean, this is something that we geek out on, offline. So it's fun to just get to do this with you and share it with your people. And I just feel honored to be asked back. This has been fun. I keep forgetting that we're recording. I feel like we're like going into something, and then I'm like, whoa.
Yeah, it feels really good. Feels really cool, like the energy of in person. And I'm sure this won't be the last time.
Yeah.
So
great.
thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.